part 4 of the units that deal with the text. Before we dive into Revelation 6, a look at where we are in the book. In the previous recording, I covered chapters 4 and 5. Those two chapters are the introduction or the setting for the opening of the seals beginning here in chapter 6 verse 1. This sequence is interrupted by chapter 7, which is called a church interlude here. And following that interruption, the second series of 7 scenes in the book of Revelation is completed in 8 verse 1. So notice that the chapter division here is unfortunate. 8 verse 1 describes the opening of the 7th seal and therefore really belongs with chapter 6 and 7, not chapter 8. Now, in chapter 5, John had noticed a scroll representing in some way God's purpose for creation, perhaps a document of ownership or a testament. It turned out that the Lamb was worthy to take this scroll and open it. And at this point in the book, 6 verse 1, the Lamb will begin to break each of the seals, and with each seal there will be a scene that John sees and describes for us. The first 4 seals form a group. The opening of each of these 4 brings out a horse and its rider. We get to see 4 horses in different colors. Now, before we ask the question of what each horse represents, we face a more general question of interpretation. Does each horse represent a specific event or episode that happens only once? This is, of course, what futurism believes, though the view that most of the book of Revelation is still in the future. In this case, the 4 riders represent disasters that are still to come, although occasionally futurists will see a beginning of fulfillment in the recent past. For instance, it has been argued that the First and Second World Wars represented 1 or 2 of these riders. Now, of course, now that these wars are further and further away in the past, this makes less and less sense. But whether past or future, in this understanding, each rider represents one specific event. And preterism, the view that the book of Revelation mostly or entirely describes things in the past, may also argue for one specific fulfillment for each seal. But in this case, it would be something related to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, or in most cases, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. In my understanding, they represent something more general. I believe we are looking at basic ingredients of history. As God's purpose moves forward, as his kingdom overcomes the kingdoms and empires of this world, beginning with the Roman Empire, these things accompany that process. Perhaps it would be more accurate to understand this sequence as a look at imperialism, empire building and its consequences. The 4 riders symbolize empire building through conquest and what follows from it. Notice that they resemble the signs that Jesus spoke of in Mark 13 and Matthew 24. When asked about the destruction of the temple, Jesus spoke of wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes and famines and persecution. He also stated, "These things are not the end, but the beginning of birth pangs." Well, they definitely happened in the 1st century, before the destruction of Jerusalem even. But they have happened in every century since. To a large extent, this is what history is made of. Therefore, basic ingredients of history. This painting by the Russian artist Vaznezo, by the way, shows the 4 riders. Now, assuming that they are indeed basic components of history, or the consequences of wars of conquest, what might each horse represent? The first one is white. In other places, this is a good color. For this reason, some have argued that the white horse symbolizes the gospel, moving victoriously through the world, or even that the rider on the white horse is Jesus himself. That's unlikely, because Jesus is the one opening the seals. Besides, the color white can indeed symbolize purity, which is positive, but it can also stand for victory, which is more neutral. On a day celebrating a significant military victory, Roman citizens would sometimes dress in white. In this case, the victory is that of an empire, which is not positive. The white horse represents wars of conquest. As stated in verse 2, conquest is its goal. Probably the other three riders, and seals 5 and 6 as well, are the result of conquest and empire building. Further slaughter, famine, epidemics, persecution, and a showdown with the Lamb are bound to follow. Think Ukraine. We see it happening right now as I'm recording this. Now, if this is true, we should not think of the riders as judgments sent by God, but as the result and fruit of human empire building. Interestingly, the rider on the white horse has a bow. This would have reminded the early readers of the Parthians. The Parthians were a warlike nation living east of the Euphrates, that is, beyond the easternmost boundary of the Roman Empire. They were great horsemen and highly skilled with bow and arrow. A Parthian horseman could ride full speed, shoot an arrow, and still hit a target. Several times the Parthians had invaded the east of the Roman Empire and done much damage. It had taken great effort to expel them. And the Roman Empire never succeeded in subduing the Parthians. They were feared by the Romans and they posed a constant threat in the east. Second horse, red. Red is the color of blood. This rider also represents war, but perhaps of a different kind, civil war or out-of-control war and slaughter. Civil wars tend to be more drawn out and bloodier than wars of conquest. Just think of Syria or the 30-Year War in Germany in the 17th century. It is estimated that a third of the population of Germany perished in that conflict, many of them through famine and epidemics. Number 3, black. Now, black is obviously a bad color. This rider comes with a pair of scales and announces the price of wheat and barley. The price is high, literally 1 denarius. A worker had to work a full day to earn this much. It would buy him just enough wheat for himself. He could also use it to buy barley, and then it would suffice for 3 people. But there would not be anything left for other expenses. In other words, this rider represents scarcity and therefore economic hardship, which often follows war. Again, think Ukraine. The third rider is told not to harm the oil and wine, 6 verse 6. This suggests that we are still in the context of war. Oil came from olive trees and wine from vines. Both crops need many years of growth before they produce good harvests. It would be foolish, therefore, to destroy them in a war of conquest, because it would diminish the value of the territory conquered. It would need many years to recover. Probably, therefore, these 4 horses represent a sequence. They are linked. They show the consequences of war and empire building, represented by the white horse. This leads to bloodshed, famine, economic suffering, and all sorts of diseases and epidemics. The next rider. He rides a pale horse. Literally, the color is green or pale green. This is a decidedly unhealthy color for a horse or a human being. Its rider is Death, and he is followed by Hades, the abode of the dead in Greek mythology, and here personified as a spiritual power. Notice in verse 8 that they are given authority. What happens on earth is firmly controlled and restrained by heaven. Next, John gets to see the martyrs, those who had been killed because of their testimony. This too is something that's not limited to one phase of history. True believers have often been persecuted. What does it mean that John sees them under the altar? Well, it is a place of honor. It suggests that God counts their death as a precious sacrifice. In this scene, we again learn that heaven is in charge and that things have not run out of control even as Christians are dying, because a limit has been set in the form of a number. In the remainder of chapter 6, we deal with scene number 6. As argued in the introduction, looking at the structure of the book, this marks the end, the final judgment. Indeed, what we read here sounds like the end of creation and the total collapse of the cosmos. The sun turns black, stars fall from the sky itself vanishes like a scroll that is rolled up. Well, even though this is apocalyptic language and not to be taken literally, it still tells us we are looking at the last day here. In the Old Testament, it was called the Day of the Lord. In Revelation, it has become the day of their wrath. It comes from both the one seated on the throne and from the Lamb. At this point, the sequence of 7 seals is interrupted. John hears that the servants of God need to be sealed, and he hears their number, 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe of Israel. Now notice that this cannot be in chronological order. After the day of wrath, there is no more need for sealing, placing them under protection, as described here. Now, Futurism understands this scene as the future conversion of ethnic Israel shortly before the Second Coming. Presumably, so this view, all of them, or at least a large majority, will suddenly repent and turn to Christ. I have my doubts about this, and no, I don't think that that's necessarily what Romans 11 teaches. It's also possible to understand 144,000 in the preterist way as the remnant of Israel in the 1st century. Those Jews who believed in Jesus and initially made up the New Testament church before being joined by a rapidly increasing crowd of non-Jewish believers. However, I think the text points in a different direction. To begin with, Revelation does not make a separation between Israel and the church. In this book there is only one people of God. And then notice that this is a strange list of tribes. 2 tribes are missing, and instead we have a tribe of Joseph. Now, presumably Joseph replaces Ephraim, Dan is left out altogether. Third and most important, those who are sealed are identified as the servants of our God in verse 3. This phrase points us back to the very first verse in the book where we are told that this book is to show his servants, that is, God's servants, what must soon take place. The phrase servants of God, therefore, refers to the readers of this book. This is not Israel or some special group of Jewish people. This group includes all believers, whether Jews or Gentiles. This is the church. There's one place in the Old Testament where we also find a census of God's people. This is in the book of Numbers. Twice in that book, the people of God are numbered. To be more precise, it's the males who are of the right age to go out in the army of Israel who are numbered. This suggests that the list in Revelation 7 is also to be understood as the army of God, the mustering of an army, and this army is the church. What is the seal? Based on Ephesians 1, it may well be the Holy Spirit. The seal is a sign of ownership and protection. Why 144,000? Well, 12 is the number of God's people, 12 tribes, 12 apostles. That there are 12,000 tells us the number is large, 10 times 10 times 10. 12,000 multiplied by 12 tribes makes for the full and complete number of God's people. And now, something that's very important, when does John get to see them? Well, at this point, there is a parallel to Revelation chapter 5. There, John heard about the Lion of Judah, but when he looked, he saw a lamb. And here in chapter 7, John hears the number of 144,000, but when he looks in verse 9, he sees a great multitude that no one can count. This means that the 2 groups, the 144,000 and the innumerable crowd, are one and the same. What we learn about them is this. On the one hand, 144,000 is the complete number of God's people. Complete. Not even one is missing. It also shows us the church as God's army. The multitude, on the other hand, tells us that the real, non-symbolic number is huge, beyond counting. On the one hand, then, this is the church marching into battle, and on the other hand, it is the great multitude of the redeemed, anticipated in Revelation chapter 5, verse 9 and following, from all ethnic groups, who here have arrived in the heavenly throne room. Notice how much this scene reminds us of chapter 5, and thus it is a look ahead, a preview. The second Exodus has been completed. Notice in verse 14 that these are the ones coming out of the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation is not a short period right before Jesus returns. The Great Tribulation is the entire time span between the first and the second coming of Christ. It is the age of tension, the time of overlap between the present evil age and the age to come, and therefore the time of conflict between the two kingdoms. The church that marches into battle and tribulation will come out as a great multitude. And with that knowledge, we are now ready for the last seal to be opened. This will take us beyond the end. Take a deep breath. Here we go. Well, that was exactly half a minute. Did that feel long? When I do this in class, often students don't make it for a full minute without saying or doing something. Not everyone can handle this much silence, let alone half an hour. And yet, at first sight, it feels a bit like an anticlimax. This is all? Half an hour of silence? But then, this is the heavenly throne room. Loud and exuberant worship has been going on day and night for as long as we can imagine. And suddenly, there's silence for a full half hour. That's a long time. That's impressive. It's a solemn moment. It creates an atmosphere of awe. What does it mean? Well, there are parallels in the Old Testament. Psalm 46, for instance, describes how God puts an end to war, destroying the weapons of war. And then, in Psalm 46, verse 10, he demands, "Be still and know that I am God." And in Habakkuk 2, verse 20, after announcing judgment on Babylon, the prophet states, "The Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him." In other words, this silence is the acknowledgement of the heavenly assembly that God has done well and that he is righteous and just in everything he has done. And this ends the 7 seals. The empires and tyrants of this world are no more.